And then with that motivation, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, to the merits of giving and the other perfections. May I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I'm getting out the text. And for those who have their texts or are following along, we're picking up at the top of page 307. And actually, maybe just before picking up there, I'll just say, like, as I was sort of reviewing yesterday for today's class, I felt, I was really thinking about how, like, some of you have been taking this all along. It's like 5 years, actually, of studying this particular text. And I felt sort of touched to be doing the last of 5 years worth of classes. And, after this, we'll still have the retreats, right? I'm assuming we'll do those on Zoom too, probably, so we'll do the one on bodhicitta and then the one on emptiness, and that will complete this series. But this is the last actual class studying the text itself. So anyway, something to rejoice in, I think. But so we'll pick up at the top of that page where Chijang Rinpoche's outline says, a source saying that at the time when investigation induces calm abiding and special insight simultaneously unite in mutual association. So we're in like kind of the last couple points of this section on the union of calm abiding and special insight. So we got through most of that last time, but we're towards the end of that. And so remember, I'll just remind people, kind of, because it's been a little while. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? If you nod, it sounds all right and everything? Okay, good. So Tsongkhapa was kind of explaining, right, how to achieve this union, right, union of calm abiding and special insight, which is one of the main goals of, in order to progress to liberation, you have to do that, right? But so Tsongkhapa had explained earlier in the section we covered last time that first you have to achieve calm abiding, right? And the person has to have achieved calm abiding prior to achieving a union of calm abiding and special insight. And he made a point. He said, you can't achieve the union of two things if you don't have one of them, right? So you have to have calm abiding first. And then he made this point that there are various kinds of insights we can have, right, into various things, including emptiness, but that's different than special insight, right? And so when the practitioner is going to gain this union of calm abiding and special insight, they already have calm abiding. Then they begin to do what analytical meditation, right? In this case, analytical meditation, in the example he's giving, it would be on emptiness, right? And what happens for that practitioner is they're in this state of calm abiding, but then as they start to do analytical meditation on the nature of the self and selflessness or emptiness, that movement of their mind, that an analytical process, at first takes them out of the state of calm abiding, right? So they go backwards in their concentration. They still have a better concentration than we do, of course, because they've already achieved calm abiding. But the process of analysis at first takes them down. Remember, there are like 9 levels that one goes through in achieving calm abiding, right? One achieves the 9th level and then achieves what's called bliss and pliancy, and that becomes fully qualified calm abiding. So then for that practitioner who's achieved calm abiding, when they're doing this in analytical meditation, they may go back, right, to the 7th level, the 5th level, the 8th level of abiding, right? And they're doing their analysis. And they have to keep going back and forth, right? So sometimes they focus more on the calm abiding in order to get that tranquility of mind. Then they switch and they do a bit more analytical meditation in order to gain insight. And at first, what's the word? Each gets in the way of the other a little bit, right? Like, so when they do too much analysis, they lose some of their tranquility. Then if they do too much tranquility, they aren't gaining new insight, or they're not giving rise to insight. And so they get better and better at this process of, what's the word? Uniting those two or balancing those two. And then that's where we get up to here. So then in the section that we're up to now, Tsongkhapa is kind of explaining. So he quotes a text called Instructions on the Perfection of Wisdom, where he says, then you observe that very image connected with analysis. When you experience both of them in your mind through the continuum of uninterrupted and unobstructed mental attention, it is called the path of union between calm abiding and special insight. That is to say, calm abiding and special insight are a pair, and their relation is one of conjunction. They operate bound to each other. Then he says, unobstructed means there is no need to stop the process of analytical meditation and place the mind in non-conceptuality. Non-conceptuality is induced by the analytical meditation itself. So that's really the crucial point, is that up until this point, up until you achieve this union of calm abiding and special insight, what's happening is that, as I was just describing, the analytical meditation is taking the person out of calm abiding. They're no longer, they're losing that sense of bliss and pliancy and absolutely penetrative concentration. The unique feature that qualifies something as a union of calm abiding and special insight is what Tsongkhapa says here, right? So it's that your non-conceptual, totally concentrated, blissful, pliant, meditative experience at this point is able to be induced by analysis itself. So up to that point, the practitioner, and actually we all do this in our own lesser way, right? You contemplate something, right, until you give rise to not a special insight, but a kind of insight, and then you focus your mind on it, right? That's ordinary meditation that we do. And even at this level, the person's still having to do a version of that until they get to this union, right? So the yogi is meditating on emptiness, and then they have to kind of, what's the word? Intentionally focus their mind on that emptiness and stop contemplating. Does that make sense? Stop analyzing. For the person who achieves the union of calm abiding and special insight, they don't have to do that anymore. Their meditation becomes one in which there's a union, which means the analysis itself induces the bliss and the pliancy and the completely focused mind. So that's a unique feature at that level. So that person, their calm abiding no longer obstructs their analytical insight, and their analytical insight no longer obstructs their calm abiding. And so that's a unique sort of achievement for a meditator. And what Tsongkhapa says is that, the person before that level has already achieved calm abiding, right? That practitioner already had achieved calm abiding. But here it's a unique, more penetrating calm abiding, right? Because that other person's calm abiding, they had to avoid analysis. This person can analyze, and that analysis itself will deepen their concentration. Does that make sense, kind of? So it's a unique level or a unique kind of experience. And remember what I said once before, that for this, this is the difference. When a person achieves the union of calm abiding and special insight into emptiness, in particular, that special insight, at that point they've progressed to the path of preparation, right? Of the 5 paths, right? Before that, they could be on the path of accumulation. This is the person who's now achieved the path of preparation, where they're preparing to have a direct insight into emptiness. This is not yet direct because it's still a level of conceptual subject-object dualism, but the unique feature, again, just to emphasize that point, right, is where analysis itself induces bliss and pliancy and calm abiding. So they don't have to kind of stop analysis in order to concentrate. The analysis induces that meditative concentration. And anyway, so that's what he says there. Then I'll go on to the next paragraph. Tsongkhapa says, to experience both is to experience both calm abiding that observes the non-conceptual image and special insight that observes the image connected with analytic conceptions. Through the continuum should be understood from he's quoting there, through the continuum should be understood from the point of view that the analytical special insight and calm abiding at the end of the analysis do not arise simultaneously. However, when there is actual calm abiding induced by the power of analysis, both special insight, the intense differentiation of phenomena that observes the mode, and calm abiding, the meditative stabilization that firmly and single-pointedly abides on the mode, operate in association. At such a time, calm abiding and special insight are mixed and operate equally. So I think that's pretty straightforward, right? So he's describing that though. So one is they're balanced. They both operate equally. And there's another point. Just going back. And I guess I want to make one more point, right? The person before that level, their meditative object could be emptiness, right? They could have already achieved some kind of conceptual understanding of emptiness, and then they could be practicing calm abiding, focused on that emptiness. But there, it's a generic image of emptiness, right? That's not fresh, right? And as he describes it here, an intense differentiation of phenomena that observes the mode, right? Earlier on the previous couple pages ago, he had used different terms, right? Like extreme clarity, so there's an experience obviously that's being described here that's not, that's different, right? Where there's a kind of intensity, an intense insight, an intense clarity to the person's understanding of emptiness, right? And it's conjoined with that meditative stability. Does that make sense? So it's not just like a generic image that was given rise to previously. The person is contemplating and freshly giving rise to an intensely clear, intense differentiation, intense understanding, intense insight, different ways to say the same thing. And that insight in and of itself is inducing calm abiding. Anyway, that's the point here. Then he says, I want to say a couple of things. Well, he says here, for that, it is necessary to gain a realization arisen from meditation. And then this next paragraph, actually, I think the translation is a little confusing. So I actually went and found, it's the same, there's the same paragraph in the Great Treatise. So he actually quotes himself in this one. In other words, he wrote the same paragraph in the Great Treatise. I like this translation better. So I'm actually going to turn to that. For those who need to look it up, but it's on page 359. So what he says, and here it's the same, it's just translated differently, but it's the same Tibetan. So do not mistake the union of serenity and insight for a composite in which wisdom can analytically discriminate the meaning of selflessness from within an essentially unchanging, non-discursive state of solid stability, like a small fish moving beneath still water without disturbing it. Know how to unite serenity and insight according to what appears in the original texts. Do not put confidence in explanations derived from anything else. From the viewpoint of these Indian texts, it would seem that I must distinguish the many features of how you attain serenity and insight meditation. But I'm wary of being long-winded, so I will not write more now. I will write no more on it now. So what he's saying here is, again, prior to special insight, that's again, he's just emphasizing this point. The unique feature is this. I'm going to read a different translation of the same idea here. Before that point, analytical meditation cannot itself induce solid one-pointed stability. Therefore, reaching solid stability through analysis, extensive analysis by discriminating wisdom, comes about when special insight is achieved. Thus, the union of special insight and serenity is posited at that point. So that it's very clear there, right? That's the absolutely unique feature, is that analytical meditation in and of itself induces a kind of concentration. And so what he was saying in this one paragraph here, just to clarify, is he was saying, some people say you could have a kind of calm abiding, and then if you can sort of, while being in calm abiding, have a little bit of your mind analyzing, that would be special insight. And he's saying, no, that's not yet special insight. Special insight is when that little bit of your mind that's analyzing does so extensively and intensively, and that itself induces a deeper state of concentration. Does that make sense? So it's not enough to just be in good concentration and then do a bit of analysis. What he's saying is, you have to be, I mean, that's fine, but that's not the union of calm abiding and special insight. The union of calm abiding and special insight is not like where the person's in calm abiding and then they can analyze a little. It's where the person does intensive analysis, gains deep penetrative insight, and that insight itself induces bliss, pliancy, and totally penetrative concentration conjoined with insight. Does that make sense? So he's just differentiating, and he's saying people can get this wrong and then they don't understand the exact line, and it's an important point because you have to achieve this union in order to achieve liberation or enlightenment. So that's why he's going into that much detail. Anyway, that actually ends the section on the union of calm abiding and special insight. So maybe there I'll pause, because then he comes to another section. Any questions about that before I move on to the next section? All right, we're good.
I have a quick question.
Oh, sure.
So I've been reading Lama Yeshe's Mahamudra book,
mm-hmm.
and he talks a lot about the little fish, mindfulness fish, which I like. It's really useful. So you're saying that, the state where you're in still waters and you get your little mindfulness fish going that's not the union of calm abiding, because what you're looking for instead is for when that little fish actually induces the calm abiding itself. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
I like the fish. The fish metaphor is good for me.
I love that one too. Yeah, it comes from the Panchen Lama's, that Mahamudra. He's quoting, they translated in that book, the Panchen Rinpoche's Mahamudra text, and Lama Yeshe really elaborates on that in that book. It's a great book. Yeah, I like that, the fish metaphor too. So and it was funny, the Panchen Lama uses that metaphor, and then I was like, oh wow, this is he's in the lineage coming down from Tsongkhapa. So I was like, oh okay, here we go. When I was reading this. Yeah, but that's exactly right. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so then the next section is Trijang Rinpoche's header for it is a brief summary of the topics of the general path. So what Tsongkhapa does here is he gives a kind of he's now completed his in-depth description or teaching on each of the stages of the path. And so now he gives a brief overview of what he's just covered. And so and it's in the same order as he taught it in. So he starts where he says, now I will present a brief summary of the topics of the general path. Before anything else, the root of the path rests on the way you rely on a spiritual teacher. So you should be clear and decisive about that. So, and in the text, that was the very first point, right? That's always the first point of the Lamrim. Is how to rely on a Lama or how to rely on a spiritual teacher, right? And they're all the different points, he doesn't go, and in this section, you'll see in each of these, he's just doing as it says, a brief overview, right? So, but when you read that, what you think is like, okay, that's like, what are the qualities of a spiritual teacher, right? There are 10 qualities of a Mahayana teacher. There are various other qualities if you want to, for just a general Buddhist teacher. Then there are 10 specific qualities if somebody's going to teach Mahayana. Then there are 10 other qualities if somebody's going to teach lower tantras. Then 10 more qualities if somebody's going to teach the highest yoga tantra. So what are the qualities of a spiritual teacher? Then thinking of the teacher as the Buddha, right? Then thinking of the kindness of the teacher, how to relate to the teacher in thought, how to relate to the teacher in action, and so on. So it's all those points. So that's what he's getting at here, right? Is he saying, and that's the what he says, right? That's the foundation. How does he say it? The root of the path, right? So like how the root of a tree, the existence of the tree depends on the root, right? In another famous text, right, Tsongkhapa says, the foundation of all good qualities is the kind, virtuous friend, right? The foundation of all good qualities. That's actually the title of the text, right? So, so anyway, so relating to the spiritual teacher is the preliminary point. That's the basis for all the others, right? Because how do you study these topics if you don't have a Lama? Then he says, so, and then after that, right, then if an uncontrived wish to take the essence of your leisure has arisen, it will urge you on to practice from within. Therefore, to generate it, you should meditate on the topics of the leisures and endowments, right? So there, what's that referring to? You guys know this now, right? It's referring to a precious human rebirth, right? With 8 freedoms and 10 endowments, and then and you think about how it's it's difficult. What are those 10 leisures, 8 leisures and 10 endowments? They're difficult to find. It's difficult to create the causes of them. They're rare to find in the world. They're rare by nature, and so on. And then there are various examples, right? That famous example of like it's called the turtle, right? That raises its head once every 100 years, and somebody threw a little, they call it floating circle like this size, into like, if you imagine, right? That's that famous story, right? If somebody threw that into the Indian Ocean, and then like the turtle left from California, and it was blind, and once every 100 years it came up to take a breath, and then went back down. What are the odds it would ever put its head through the circle? And the idea is, actually, I just want to emphasize that one, right? The idea is you're that. Like, in other words, if you think about that, you say it's impossible, almost impossible, right? It would, like, unless you think of an infinite amount of time, it would never happen, right? Like, a billion years, it probably wouldn't happen, right? And then you think, like, it's a metaphor, right, for you, actually. Like, that you're the one who put your head through you have the precious human rebirth. It's that rare, right? There's another traditional example they give where they say, if you think of like all the sand on all the beaches on the planet, how much sand that is, and on all the deserts also, like you can imagine all the sand on all the beaches and deserts of this planet. And then you say, how much sand, if you dropped some on your fingernail, how much would stay? And it says, you're the sand that's on the fingernail compared to everyone else, the existence, in other words. And the idea is that you have this amazing opportunity, right, that you have to use well, right? And we don't think that way, right? We just think, oh, well, we don't think our life is that special oftentimes. So anyway, you contemplate that again and again until you have this incredibly, strong wish to make use of your life of leisures and endowments. Because you're like, actually you could think that, right? Like I was noticing that people say that, right? Like, like if somebody's like, in this time period when things are terrible in the world, sometimes people say, well, if you have if you're a billionaire, you should help, right? You should help other people. Like people get upset that the billionaire doesn't, which I don't blame them. But the idea is that you're the billionaire, actually. Like you're the person who has the 8 freedoms and 10 endowments. It's your responsibility in a way, right? Like you have the ability. Everybody else doesn't have that, right? Like ants can't, which are numberless, right? Minnows and insects, and they're countless, but they can't practice the path to enlightenment and enlighten others. Only you can do that. So the idea is you have a responsibility because you have the incredible wealth, spiritual wealth of this kind of rebirth. So anyway, that's the idea there. And then it says, then if your endeavor for the things of this life is not inverted, a serious endeavor for future lives will not arise. Therefore, apply yourself to the meditation on impermanence and the fact that this body you have obtained will not last long, and the way you wander in the lower realms after death. Right? So there you would do the 9-point death meditation, right? With the 3 roots, right? The certainty of death, the uncertainty of the time of death, and the certainty that only the Dharma benefits the time of death. And do you see what I'm getting at here? I just want to point something out, right? Why is Tsongkhapa summarizing here? Well, one is, I guess he's summarizing what he just taught. But another is, we should, like, how do I say this right way? We should memorize the sort of outline of the path. Does that make sense? We've now studied this whole Lam Rim. And, I just want to say that for like practical instruction for a second. We should now, because each of us is familiar with the Lam Rim, one thing we should do is we should know the overall structure of the Lam Rim path is one point, because it's the structure of our path to enlightenment, right? And then the other is we should gradually memorize the core meditations. You don't have to memorize all the quotations, of course. You don't have to memorize all, you're not going to memorize, most of us will not memorize. Tibetans often do, right? But we're not going to mostly memorize this book. It's kind of big. But we can memorize what are the 9-point death meditation, right? What are the 7-point cause and effect method for bodhicitta? What are the 8 freedoms and the 10 endowments and so on? Because these are like core teachings that we should meditate on throughout our life, right? So those things we should probably, ideally we would memorize. And so they should become very familiar to us. And one of the points is, so this idea of endeavor for the things of this life not to be inverted, right? So what he's getting at there is that, a sign of, if you're actually it's a sign if you're actually practicing Dharma, right? Is if you have more interest in something beyond this life than you do in the affairs of this life, right? If your main interest is your own comfort in this life and your own sort of ease and pleasure of this life, well, that's actually like the teachings say, right? That's no different from, we use different examples, right? That's no different from what like a rat does. Whereas rats also want to get comfortable in this life. And that's okay, that's what rats do, but if you're practicing a spiritual path, then it shouldn't be that. It should be the same as that, right? It should be something beyond that. And so the idea is that you would have more interest, for example, in bodhicitta than in your own comfort, right? Or you would have more interest in liberation, or at least you would have more interest. The minimum requirement, right, is you would have more interest in future lives than in your own comfort, right? And actually, that's actually a good tool for us to reflect on, like on any given day, because I could say, oh, I practice Dharma, right? But then if I check and I think, well, today, this day, am I more interested in my own comfort, or am I interested in something spiritual? And if I'm answering myself, it's not it's actually for ourselves, a mirror, right, to hold up. And then if I say, well, today, actually, the truth is I've been more interested in my own comfort, then I'm not practicing Dharma yet. And then what do? What's the solution to that? It's not like some self-blame thing, right? He's saying here, what's the solution to that? Think about precious human rebirth. Think about impermanence and death, and that will induce a sense of wanting to think about something, that'll induce, what's the word? Spiritual thoughts, right? And actually we know that, actually, have you seen, I've noticed that even with people, right? Like people who aren't, have no interest in spirituality usually, and things like that, right? If you talk to them, right after someone they love died, then they are temporarily interested in spirituality. If that's not their thing, then they forget about it, right? So the point is that thoughts of impermanence are what induce this. If you think you're going to live forever, which we don't literally think, but we kind of live that way, it's our underlying assumption, then we don't practice the spiritual path, right? So we have to think about impermanence. There's a famous quote that Lama Zopa often mentions where it says, if you don't think about impermanence in the morning, then your day, by midday, you'll be totally distracted by desires, And if you don't think about impermanence at midday, then in the then the evening, you'll just be caught up in worldly things. So the point is that we have to actually apply these teachings day in and day out, right? According to our own level at any given point. And then next one is, he says, and then think about the lower realms, right? And then he says, if you think about how you yourself, actually it's like that. Like I was just watching a video, I don't know if you've seen, but Lama Zopa has been posting videos of teachings from Kopan. He's at Kopan in Nepal. And almost every day he's sort of putting up a video. And he was saying it's very much like Lama Zopa is a very unique person. But anyway, he was saying this point, he was pointing out how everybody, the whole planet, right? People are so appropriately, in a way, afraid of coronavirus, right? Afraid of the suffering and so on. And then he was saying, I think sometimes I laugh because only Lama Zopa does this kind of thing, where he would say, then he's saying, of course that's scary, right? And then he's saying, but there's so much to be scared of. And then he starts describing hell realms, and he's saying like, it's much worse than coronavirus. I think he was describing what each of the various hell realms, they're in this text too, And he starts saying, there's one hell realm, I can't remember the number of times you get poked by a spear every hour. Spears like are poking you, and then there are ones where you catch fire. And then he was saying, like, so, there are a lot of things to be afraid of in samsara, was his point. Then he was saying, so generate the wish for liberation. Don't just get the, he's saying, don't just get the wish. He says, of course you don't want to get sick. He says, that's a normal thing, right? He's saying, people have this wish, oh, I don't want to get sick. I don't want to get sick. And he said, good, but that's not enough. He said, like, you should want to become free of samsara. That's like an ocean of suffering. And he said, so it's not enough. He said, then if you think I won't get sick with this, then you'll get sick with something else eventually. But if you achieve liberation, that's the only way to become free of suffering overall, right? And so that's a Buddhist context, right? That Tsongkhapa is getting at here is think about the sufferings of samsara, which they say, right, are like a depthless oceans of suffering of samsara. And then Lama Tsongkhapa points out, if you think about those topics, I could die any second, right? And then if when I die, it's not if, because it's definite, I will die, right? But I don't know when. Right, and then he's saying, and then if you think, like, when I die, I don't know, I won't go to lower realms, right? Even if I take rebirth as a human being, actually, it's kind of like if you look around the planet, right? It's not so. Just being a human being is not necessarily so great an achievement in and of itself. If you look at the amount of suffering that humans have, and then the teachings say most beings don't take rebirth as humans, right? Most humans who die take rebirth in lower realms. And so what he's getting at here is he's saying, if you think that way about yourself, if you think I'm not an exception to that, then you'll want to take strong refuge in the three jewels, and then you'll want to guard karma, right? Then you'll start to think about the teachings on karma in a different way, and you'll do it out of a sense of deeper concern because it's relevant to you. Does that make sense? It gives the teachings on karma more relevance, and so he's saying you would do that, right? So he says. The actual phrasing Tsongkhapa does, he says, at that time, the natural attitude of conscious fear will arise. So you should sincerely develop the certainty about the positive qualities of the three jewels, abide by the vow of common refuge, and train in its trainings. Right? And so, because part of this requirement, remember, again, all these things are taught in this text, part of the requirement for refuge is fear, right? In other words, refuge means you have faith or trust in something, but also you're afraid of something, right? And so you're turning for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, out of a fear of your own suffering, the suffering of others, various sufferings of lower realm, suffering of samsara, anything like that. And then he says, and then you should develop faith from many angles, a faith of conviction in cause and effect, actions and their effects, karma. The foundation of all white dharmas, and having made it firm, you should try to engage in virtue and counteract non-virtue, always entering the path of the four powers. And so actually that covers the low scope of the Lamrim, right? That whole paragraph covers the first scope, right? The scope of the low scope, I'll call it. The next paragraph, he now turns his attention to the middle scope. So he says, once you have thus garnered the cycle of teachings of lesser beings, right? So low scope or scope of lesser beings, you should think about the general and specific disadvantages of cyclic existence or samsara a lot, and turn your mind as much as you can from cyclic existence in general. And again, I'm just going to emphasize this point, right? Like, if we're practicing the path, right? Like, I'm just actually Lama Zopa, I'm just quoting Lama Zopa, but he was saying this point also. He was saying, when you see like suffering, right? Like it's easy right now. Oftentimes we're distracted, right? But right now, first of all, we have more time, because many of us do anyway. Second point, though, is it's easier to see suffering, right? Economic suffering, illness, death, insecurity, right, and so on. And what Lama Zopa was pointing out was he was saying, like, if you're interested in practicing Dharma, then this is a really useful time for your practice, actually, right? Because it's like it needs to be visceral, right? In other words, we can intellectualize sometimes and think like, oh yes, you know, samsara is bad, nirvana is good, but what we want it to do is to affect us on that deeper level, right? And so when you actually see suffering, this is one way to use, you know, there's a whole Lojong teaching, right? Mind training teachings. And the point of the mind training teachings is how do you use whatever arises to help you practice the path more, right? To help you progress on the path. And so in that sense, when you see suffering in the world, in your own mind, and in the experience of others, one of the various many uses of it is here, right? Is that you then think this is the nature of samsaric existence, right? Of course this happens. And it's going to happen over and over and over, you know, various kinds of suffering, right? And that's the reality, actually, you know. And sometimes, like if we live in what's the word, you know, living in the West and DC area is a little bit privileged. It's easy to kind of pretend that's not true or something, but the truth is we're all vulnerable to suffering. Right? And the idea is here is that you would think about that again, as he says, again and again deeply, right? Until you start to feel that it's like, what's the metaphor they often use? Like you're in a prison, right? And all you want is to get out, right? How do you get out? By understanding emptiness, right? By gaining insight into emptiness. And that there's no physical prison. It's a prison of ignorance, right? And mental afflictions and karma. Anyway, so you think over and over again about, and that's what he says here, then identify the causes from which cyclic existence arises, karma and the mental afflictions, and develop an uncontrived desire to abandon them, right? And I want to point that out too, because like sometimes people get confused about this point, where they think, oh, I want to be free from samsara, as if that means extinction, or as if that means running away, or as if that means there's someplace else to go, like a monastery or go to Tibet or something, right? But here, Tsongkhapa is very clear, right? He says, first of all, uncontrived, right? That means not, what's the word? Natural, spontaneous, not just intellectualized, right? And what is he saying? He's saying the desire to abandon the causes of samsara. What are those? Ignorance, karma, and the other mental afflictions, right? Inside your own continuum, right? So that's what we're trying to develop, this intense wish to be liberated from, right? And it's this, and actually, do you think that, right? That the causes of my, like when you're afraid of suffering, do you think, oh, the cause of my suffering is my karma, my mental afflictions, ultimately my ignorance. Anyway, that's what he's saying here, right? So you would contemplate over and over again until that becomes your worldview in the moment, right? And then you apply yourself to the 3 trainings, right? 3R trainings, higher training in ethics, higher training in concentration, and higher training in wisdom. And in particular, the vow of individual liberation, right? And that could be a monk or nun vow, or it could be a layperson vow, right? Like not, and you could take, you know, with the layperson vows, you can take 1, 2, 3, or all 5, you know, 4 or 5. There are 5 of them, you know, and then there are various levels of monastic ordination. But so what he's getting at there is that's the middle scope, right? What's the middle scope is that you develop the renunciation of samsara. You would think about those lists. There are lists, the 8 suffering. There are 3 types of suffering. There's a list of 8. There's a list of 10. Anyway, you can pick for yourself which list you want to focus on. But the point is that you would think about these things over and over again, right? That's the Lama practice. And that's the middle scope. And again, right, you would familiarize your mind with these. So first of all, you know the outline of what's the Lamrim, and then you would, you know, particularly the meditations to focus on, because you focus on those in your sitting meditation, but also if you just have free time, you know, if you're waiting somewhere outside, or it's something you can think about. If you're out for a walk, you can think about one of these topics because you're trying to familiarize your mind with them. All right, and then the next paragraph is the great scope, of course, right? Because he's going through the 3 scopes because he's summarizing the whole best. So low scope, middle scope, great scope. So he says, once you have garnered the cycle of training of intermediate, right, the intermediate scope beings, contemplate that just like you yourself have fallen into the ocean of existence many others have, right? Train in bodhicitta, which has a root in love and compassion. You need to try as hard as you can for it to arise. I want to pause there for a second, right? So what he's getting at there is, one point is, right, that we first have to think about our own suffering. Does that make sense? He just pointed that out. Then you turn and you recognize others' suffering is the same as mine. Does that make sense? And that applies all the time. Like, so that's how the practice works, right? So you have to kind of, if you're not willing to look at how you yourself are subject to suffering, then your compassion for others is going to be, what's the word? Like flimsy or not real. So you have to, that's why they come in sequence. And I'm pointing out, one is, in general, in the path, you have to focus on the middle scope before and low scope before you can focus on the great scope. But also, even if you've done that, there come times where, like, you're distracting yourself from your own suffering, you're not facing it, right? And then again, your compassion and bodhicitta will become, what's the word? Like, kind of intellectualized or disingenuous or something. And that means we have to again look back and look at our own mind and go, okay, wow, this is what it's like to be a samsaric being. And then you turn to others and you recognize they're all suffering just like I am. They all have these same kinds of problems. And then, so that they have fallen into, and then when you understand the depth and the nature of the sufferings of samsara, and you understand that's true for others as well, right? And then where he says, train your mind in it, right? What does that mean? That means you have to practice one of those two methods, right? In this text, he emphasizes the method of the 7-point cause and effect method, right? Recognizing all beings as your mother. Right? You think of the kindness of the mother. You wish to repay that kindness. You generate love. You generate compassion. You generate like an unusual attitude of universal responsibility. And then that gives rise to bodhicitta, right? So bodhicitta is not just thinking, may all beings be free from suffering. That's compassion, right? Bodhicitta has to come about through a process, and we have to train ourselves in that process, right? The other method for generating bodhicitta is the equalizing and exchanging self for others, which includes tonglen. But anyway, we have to, so what he's getting at here is you have to train, right? None of these things come about causelessly. You have to train your mind in the practices if you want to give rise to those things. And then he says, without bodhicitta, the 6 perfections and the 2 stages, meaning the 2 stages of highest yoga tantra, and so forth, are like a roof without foundations. So it's like, it would be like as if you built a house with no, if you built a house on the beach with no foundation, that's what it's like if you try to practice the 6 perfections or tantra. Actually, Kenshin Rinpoche once said that to me. He said if somebody were to go, if somebody didn't have bodhicitta and they went in retreat to practice tantra, he said mostly it would just be a waste of time, actually, because it would be like that, right? The house would get blown over, in other words. They'd do a bunch of work and it wouldn't actually be stable. Then he said if they have bodhicitta and they do the retreat on the 2 stages of highest yoga tantra, then wow, they'll achieve enlightenment very quickly. That's the differentiating point. Whether you're practicing sutra or tantra, or you have to practice both actually if you're practicing tantra, but that's the way to do it. So bodhicitta is the foundation of the Mahayana path. Then he says, when you have a little, and now this is an important point, when he says, when you have some little experience of bodhicitta, you should assume it through a ritual and apply yourself to its trainings so that you make the aspirational mind as stable as you can. And so that's where you take the bodhisattva vow, right? And actually some of you were planning to, and then of course the coronavirus hit and Kenshin Rinpoche had to cancel his visit. So we weren't able to host that, and so we didn't get to receive that, but I'm sure that will happen once Rinpoche can travel again. So at some point we'll host that for those who haven't taken the bodhisattva vow. You can take it, and for those who have, you can take it again to renew your vows. But so he's saying, right, once you, and actually it's an important point, when do you take the bodhisattva vow? He says, when you have some little experience, right? You don't have to be a bodhisattva already. But once you are familiar with bodhicitta and appreciate bodhicitta and have a little bit of experience in meditation, that's an appropriate point at which to take the bodhisattva vow. He says, then hear about the great waves of bodhisattva conduct. Which is a beautiful metaphor, right? The great waves of the deeds of bodhisattvas. He says, then as you get to know the boundary between what you should counteract and what you should engage in, generate the desire to train in it. When that has arisen, take the engaging vow through the ritual. And so there's a point there I'll make, which is there are actually two types of bodhisattva vows. There's the wishing vow, which is like where it's an aspirational vow, right? At the first vow is the wishing. Sometimes you, and actually I'll also make a point, nowadays they're given, sometimes they're given separately, where a person could first take the wishing vow and later take the engaging vow. And sometimes they're just given together. It depends on your choice. It depends both on the Lama and also on the student, which you prefer and which the Lama wants to give or something. But with the wishing vow, it's like, first they often say it this way. The wishing vow would be like if you said, oh, I have this wish to someday visit California. Right? That's like taking a wish, right? It's a wish. Then when you say, oh, I'm going, like I bought my ticket, whatever, I planned it out, I made my reservations and I'm going, that's the engaging version, right? So the wishing vow of bodhicitta is where you think, I would like to achieve enlightenment. The engaging vow is where you're committing to actually practicing the 6 perfections. Day in and day out, that's your life, you're committing to actually practicing that. And one point is with the, we'll go over, someday if you want, we can have an actual commentary on this. It's not part of this, but with the wishing vow, there are like 4 white dharmas and 4 dark dharmas. There are things to do to sort of keep that wish, nurture that within you. And then with the engaging vow, there are actual lists of like true formal vows. Like I think it's 18 root vows and 40 something auxiliary vows. And those are vows that connect to the 6 perfections. So they're vows like to actually do certain things where you're committing to doing those things. And examples are like, like if somebody's really in need and they, one of the perfections is generosity, right? So one of the vows would be like, if somebody's desperately in need and asks you for help, you don't, for no reason, blow them off, right? Somebody's really sick and they need your help, you don't ignore them. Things like that. So there are vows to do bodhisattva deeds, in other words, to not ignore the needs of others and to go help them. And they include, there are various vows like that. So anyway, those are great to study. And those you can study without taking them. You can just study them anytime you want. They're in English. Then he says, so once you've taken the vow, train in the 6 perfections and ripen your continuum by means of the four means of gathering disciples so that you ripen the continuum of others. In particular, risk your life to avoid the root downfalls. Those are those 18 root downfalls of the bodhisattva vow I just mentioned. Try hard not to be tainted by small and medium contaminations or infractions either. If you are, try hard to restore your vow. So that's clear, right? He's just saying, once you take the bodhisattva vow, keep it. Study the meaning of the vows, study the points of the vows, and then, work at keeping those vows. And if you make a mistake, purify it and refresh your vow. And then he makes a point, because this text had a long section on the union of karma abiding, special insight, and their union, which we just finished. So he says, of the 6 perfections, that's 2 of them, right? The perfection of concentration, the perfection of wisdom. So he says, you need to train in the last 2 perfections in particular, right? Meaning concentration and wisdom. Therefore, become skilled in the method for sustaining concentration and accomplish meditative stabilization. Do everything you can for the pure view of the 2 selflessnesses, right? The selflessness of persons and selflessness of phenomena to arise within your mind. Having found that selflessness, understand how to sustain it by placing the mind in the context of the view and sustain it. Such concentration and wisdom are designated with the names calm abiding and special insight. However, since they are not different from these 2, they come within the points of training in the bodhisattva vow once it has been taken. right? So the training in those is part of your bodhisattva vow at this point. So that was his overview of the path. Right, he just very briefly covered all the the structure or the outline of all the things he just had taught. And next he gives some like practical pith instructions, I think is I'll call them. I'm going to cover those in a sec. Any questions about his overview of the path before I go on to the next section? Okay, good. So now he gives some like pith instructions, what I think are good, where he says, are quite useful. He says, also, cultivating the lower paths, you should grow more and more keen on attaining the higher ones. And hear about the higher ones, you should increasingly wish to accomplish the lower ones. So I want to pause there. I think that sentence is humongously important, actually. Like, this is my own view, at least. It's obviously Tsongkhapa's, he said it. What he's saying there, right, is like, if you understand the Lam Rim correctly, like it was actually, I want to this point, because like oftentimes you come across people or situation, Buddhists, like who think, let's see if I say this right, like who are interested in the higher teachings but not in the lower teachings. That often happens, especially I think I'm not really sure, but I think that might be worse with Americans. Feeling, I'm not really sure though. But and what he's saying here is, if you're understanding the teachings correctly, like, so like if you think, like there are people who think that like, oh, I'm a practitioner of such and such Tantra or Mahamudra or something, like I don't need to meditate on impermanence. That's like basic subject, or that's like beginner thing or something. Precious human rebirth, well, that's like a preliminary training. I've moved past the preliminaries. Now, what he's saying here is, if you understand the higher teachings well, you'll gain more enthusiasm for meditating on impermanence. Does that make sense? You'll gain more enthusiasm for meditating on the sufferings of samsara. And if you understand the Lam Rim well, when you're meditating, it's actually a very important point. When you're meditating on the sufferings of samsara, you'll actually have more enthusiasm for like, wow, if I keep meditating like this, then I can really generate stronger bodhicitta. Does that make sense? You'll see how they're all interconnected. And you'll see how like none of the teachings work without the others. Does that make sense? So I think actually that's the sign of a good practitioner, is somebody who, like if they're, say it right? Like, if they're studying, say, Mahamudra, which is a high level of teaching or something, they don't view that as separate from meditation on impermanence and precious human rebirth. It's like, well, why would I be studying that? It's because I have this precious human rebirth, right? And I may die anytime, so I want to practice Mahamudra. I want to be able to practice Mahamudra, right? And then they would actually meditate more on impermanence, in order to energize their practice of Mahamudra, for example, or Chakra Samvara or something like that. Whereas he's saying here, this is Tsongkhapa's point, is if somebody thinks, now I'm practicing Mahamudra or Chakra Samvara, so like I don't need to focus on impermanence. He's saying that's a bad sign about our own practice. Does that make sense? So we should understand how all of these points are integrated, and that anyway, so I'll just leave it at that. That makes sense, right? And he says you should increasingly wish to accomplish the lower ones, right? So if you really understand bodhicitta, for example, and you appreciate bodhicitta, then it will give you more energy to think about precious human rebirth, right? Because you're like, I have to do it in this life. I can't waste my life and not realize bodhicitta, right? So I want to go back and really like get that point about precious human rebirth, so I don't waste my time, so that I can actually be a bodhisattva. See what I mean? So it's like they all start to seem, and you experience them all as interconnected. Then he says, now another pith instruction, right, or practical instruction. He says, when you meditate on them, meaning these various points of the path, you also need to purify your thoughts and balance your mind. Thus, if your respect for this, and here he's saying, well, the various points there. One is we have to practice purification, is one point. That's part of otherwise you won't make progress. But then where he's saying also balance your mind, what he's getting at is and this is, I think, very important. So I just want to slow down here and sort of, that we need to understand all the points of the Lama Rim for various reasons. One is it's the whole path to enlightenment. But there's another reason, which is on a practical level, let's see this right. Different obstacles are going to arise in your mind and my mind on different days, right? We're going to be in different inner states at different times. And we need to know what antidote to apply when certain things happen. Does that make sense? And if you don't know, if you only know one practice or something, then it's going to be quite difficult to know how to keep going. And it happens, doesn't it? Like one day, you might be like very much in a state of compassion, right? And then you could wake up the next day and just be like thinking, I don't really care about any of this. I don't feel like it. I'm tired. I just want to like distract myself. Right? And if at that point you think, oh, but I should feel great compassion like yesterday, well, maybe it doesn't work, right? So then what? And that's what Tsongkhapa is getting at here, is how do you work with your mind? You have to work with your own mind and what it's experiencing any given day. So here he says, thus, if your respect for your spiritual teacher who guides you on the path appears to be low, you put effort into the manner of relying on him, for the root of your collection of goodness would otherwise be cut off. Right? So I'll just pause there, right? Because again, what he's getting at is there may come a point where you feel great respect for your teacher, right? And great love and great devotion and then like it's possible that like a little while later, a few days later or a few months later or something, like you're distracted. Right? And you're not, what's the word? And you just feel, actually it also happens, right? Like if your teacher tells you, like if your teacher, like when your teacher tells you something you like to hear. Remember once there's one of my spiritual teachers who's passed away, his name was Geshe Lobsang Jampa. He was really funny. He said, for beginners, when we meet like he was saying like the instruction for a Lama is when you meet like a real beginner who doesn't know anything, like the instructions to the Lama is give them gifts and say sweet things to them. Because they're like a baby essentially, right? And then I thought, I was like in my 20s at the time, I was like, oh wow, he gave me all these little presents. Like I was like, he's doing that on me, And then there came a point where he stopped saying sweet things to me. Like he stopped doing that. He stopped giving me anything. And I thought, oh good, I made some progress. Like now he doesn't have to give me a present every time he sees me or something. Like he sees I'm a little more committed to the practice or something. But then there comes a point where like eventually the teacher has to tell you certain things that go against your self-centeredness, right? And then once that happens, you may find that like, so when the teacher is being sweet and saying, oh, you're great and everything's wonderful, and here I have some incense and here's a little statue or something, you think, oh, they're so sweet, they're great. But then they're like, he's getting at a point, like, right? Then there could come a point where your teacher, the Lama, like starts to give you advice that goes against your self-centeredness, right? And then you may think, well, yeah, they're great, but they're a little like, I don't know, like some kind of, you start to feel like less enthusiasm or something, right? And so what he's saying is, first of all, if they're a good teacher and they never contradict your selfishness, then something's wrong, right? Like, doesn't quite work, does it? Your ignorance, your self-grasping, your all that. So anyway, what he's saying is, so that we have to then go back, right, and think, well, wait a second, like that's what I asked for, right? Like in other words, I want it. Or if I'm in this example of a teacher, right? It's like, how is the teacher going to be kind to me? At a certain point, they have to tell me, give me feedback, right? And the truth is if we're starting off as an ignorant, confused, suffering, self-centered person, at some point the teacher has to tell us some things to do things we don't particularly feel comfortable. I don't mean like unethical. I want to be clear. The teacher should never tell you to do something unethical, and they should never tell you to do something that harms others. But I'm talking about like they might say like, practice more meditation, right? Be more generous. Practice more patience. Be patient with your enemies. Things like that, right? That's the teacher's job, right? And so then we have to remember, okay, well, wait a second. That's that's what I need, actually, right? And then you have to think about the qualities of the teacher, the kindness of the teacher, and so on. I'm gonna be 100% clear. I'm not talking there about if the teacher said something unethical. That's a different issue. Then you're supposed to go to the teacher and say, no, you can't do that. But here I'm talking about if the teacher's telling you correct practices, but you're just lazy and selfish and don't want to do them, right? That's a different thing, right? Then you have to apply the teachings. Then he says, likewise, if your enthusiasm for practice is little, you should meditate on the topic of leisures and endowments. Your main thing, whereas you should meditate on the topic of leisures and endowments, your main thing, whereas if your adherence to this life increases, you should mainly meditate on impermanence and the disadvantages of the lower realms, right? So he's getting at different points. He's saying here, another one is sometimes you have actually this happens if you look at like real practitioners, right? Sometimes people are very enthusiastic about their practice, especially at the beginning. And then sometimes people like are not enthusiastic at all and don't want to do practice, right? And the point is like, this is not to tell anybody else, it's to tell yourself, right? That if you find yourself suddenly losing your energy for practice, I actually want to give it, I think what Tsongkhapa is getting at here is actually self-compassion. And what I mean by that is this, is what he's getting at is this is how you guide yourself, right? So if you wake up and you think, I don't really feel like practicing, I don't want to, I made a commitment to meditate to myself, but I don't want to meditate, right? Then what do? Right? And what he's saying here is, on the one hand, you don't just not meditate. On the other hand, you don't like berate yourself and say, oh, I'm bad and I'm stupid and what's wrong with me, right? What he's getting at here is you be like a wise friend or a wise spiritual friend, right? So I want to give, right, like, so you would say to yourself, like, imagine that wakes up, you're right, you wake up and you just don't want to do, you said, I'm going to do meditation, you wake up and you don't want to do it, right? What he's getting, I'm going to be like, you imagine like your own inner Tsongkhapa comes to you, right? I'm just using my own metaphor here for a second. And he puts his hand on your shoulder, or it could be Tara, she puts her hand on your shoulder, and I'll do it as Tara, right? And Tara says to you, honey, you have a precious human rebirth. Look around. Like, you're unbelievably fortunate. You're beautiful. You have this amazing thing. But I love you, so I'm going to tell you the truth. You don't know how long you have to live. What really matters to you? I don't want you to die with regret. Like, what do you really care about? You may die tomorrow. What do you want to do today? You have this amazing gift, which is this day, as a human being who's met the spiritual teachings and met perfect spiritual guides. How do you want to spend your day, dear? Right? And like Tara says that to you, right? And then you think, oh, thank you, Tara. Yeah, I do want to, and she says, why did you want to meditate in the first place? Right? And think about it, right? And then you go through the points, right? Like, life is impermanent. You have the precious human rebirth. And you be your own wise support and wise guide, right? And you notice, what's my obstacle today? And then what would Tsongkhapa or what would Tara tell me to overcome that obstacle? Does that kind of make sense, what I'm getting at there? That's what he's getting here, is a practical instruction of self-compassion, that you see, where am I going astray? And then, and part of it is like, and what he's saying here is, what Tara would tell you, or what Tsongkhapa would tell you, or what Chenrezig would tell you, or whoever, is the teachings. Does that make sense? Like, they would tell you, their advice would be what Tsongkhapa wrote. It would be in different words, but maybe whatever for that moment. But that's why he says, think about it from many angles, right? And so he's getting at this point, like, so, and then there are other times where, all you care about is getting ahead, right? Like, if your adherence to this life increases, right? So it's not that you're lazy. Here he's giving another example. He's saying, one day, like, you're a spiritual person, you're practicing the path, but it happens, right? Then you suddenly find yourself on a given day where your focus is like, I just want to, all I care about is getting ahead. I'm competing with somebody and I'm trying to get whatever, more money, more status, more something, right? And he's saying, so what would Tara tell you that day? She would come and say, actually, do you ever have that experience where you really think like, she might say this: think back to things that mattered so much to you when you were competing with other people in high school or junior high. Who cares now? Like, it didn't matter. And the people you're competing with at your job or your whatever now, they're like those junior high people. Someday you're not even going to know them. You'll be at some other job. You won't ever know where they went. Like, it doesn't matter. What matters is, these deeper things, right? You're going to die someday. When you're dying, you won't care if you got who got that praise or whatever. What will matter is, did you live a life grounded in bodhicitta? That matters, always. That will matter. That will make you happy today. That will make you happy next year. That will make you happy 5 years from now. That will make you happy in your future lives. So it's like that. Does that make sense? So it's like this is a practice of compassion for yourself. Then he gives another example. He says, if you seem to neglect ethical boundaries you have accepted, you should mainly meditate on karma, right? Actions and their effects, right? So if you find yourself wanting to, and again, what's he getting at here? He recognizes we're normal people, right? I was just reading the history of Sarah Monastery, and a book came out this year on the history of Sarah May and Sarah J combined, a new book by Jose Cabezon at the University of Santa Barbara. And it was interesting. He was describing, it was actually helping me a little bit to read it, because he was describing how there were all these monks, at Sarah, right? But then there was there'd be these moments where the Mongolians were invading and the Chinese were invading, and some Tibetans took one side and some took another side. And then there was this one moment where the abbot of Sarah said to the monks, we're monks. That's not our business. Our job is to study and practice Dharma. But then half the monastery ran out, took sticks and went to join the army or something. And I was like, I'm just mentioning that, right? So there were monks who vowed not to kill, but then they went and joined one side of the Tibetan army against the other side of the Tibetan army. Against the one, whatever, they were joining the Mongolians against the Chinese or something. And so that's an example, right? You may seem, you took a vow to keep certain ethics, but then suddenly you feel so passionate about something that you forget about that. And we're all like that, right? In certain moments where we know what's ethical, but then we have the temptation not to do the ethical thing, right? That's being you. I was what was reassuring to me, I was well, they were monks in Tibet and they were doing it. So of course we all have that. And part of what he's getting at here is, again, what's that wise advice, right? You stop yourself and you think, wait a second, I'm passionate right now about whatever this is, so passionate that I would do something unethical, but how does karma work? What's the karma of that? Right? And asking that question deeply. And slowing yourself down long enough to really think deeply, what's the wise thing to do? What will bring the long-term happiness and the long-term suffering? Anyway, so that's what he's saying. Right? Then he says, if you're not feeling disillusioned with samsara and your endeavor for liberation is nothing but words, right? So you say, oh yeah, I want to achieve liberation, but the truth is that you're not really feeling it. Then you have to think about the faults of samsara, right? That's the solution to that. Then he says, if you do not seem to have great strength of mind to make everything you do into something for the benefit of all sentient beings, the root of the Mahayana will be cut off. So you should train in the aspirational mind of bodhicitta along with its causes. And then he gives a final example. He says, and if your apprehension of signs, meaning if your grasping at self-existence becomes very strong, then you should train in the meditation on emptiness, right? And if your mind is distracted, you should train in calm abiding. So the point, I'm not going to go over each one in great detail, but you get the point there. The point is that, in general, now we all have studied this. We know the points of the path, Lamrim. But the trick is that he's getting at here. So it's actually it's a very brief section. It's less than a page. but it's a humongously important one, isn't it? Which is, now, like we've learned the Lamrim topics, but now you have to introspect, right? Now comes the real work, which is you have to look at your own mind. I have to look at my mind. We each have to look at our own mind and be honest with ourselves and say, okay, because he uses this example, he says mere words, right? Is my love, or is my renunciation, or is my ethics words, or is it real today? You can't ask that question also generically. It has to be today, doesn't it? That's what he's getting at here, isn't it? It's like, where am I at today? Where am I at right this moment? And what is he getting at? He's saying, what will shift me, right? What will make me feel, what will help me get back to what's real, what's important? If I'm out of touch with ethics, or I'm out of touch, or my mind's distracted, and like right now, right, so I want to suggest that before, and then I'm going to move on to talk about Tantra, which is the last section. But I just want to suggest doing that, like, think about, he's saying to do that all the time, which is the point. But right now, it would be, in this time in the world, right, it would be, what's my reaction to coronavirus today, right? To the situation, to the changes in the world, right? Because that's what we're all facing, right? And it would be, am I distracted and agitated? Am I angry? Am I depressed and hopeless? Am I, and to be honest, I think it should, if we're honest, it's not always going to be the same. That's for sure, right? In other words, what your reaction is today and what it was a week ago and what it is a week from now aren't going to be identical. And if you're practicing Lamrim, if you're a Lamrim practitioner, you ask that question, what's real? What's my real reaction today to my life, to the situation I'm in? And then which Lamrim meditation do I apply to help myself be balanced? That's the word he used, right? To be balanced, to get back on the path, to get more deeply on the path. What do I apply in this moment? So if I'm feeling angry, right, there are teachings on patience. If I'm feeling hopeless, it'd be the precious human rebirth, right? If I'm feeling self-pity, right, it would be bodhicitta, wouldn't it? Love for others. If I'm feeling overly self-absorbed, it would be bodhicitta, right? If I'm afraid, then it'll be refuge, right? And so on. Anyway, you get the point, right? Like, so that's actually the real Lamrim practice, then, isn't it? I mean, it would be, you go through you do all the different meditations. I mean, you might dwell on one, for a long period of time, and that's also Lamrim practice. But what he's getting at here is like, so if you say, oh, lately, I want to meditate for 6 months on bodhicitta, right? But then you wake up one morning and you're feeling hopeless and despairing. Well, you don't go, what he's saying here is don't immediately go sit down and meditate on bodhicitta. Recognize, oh, I'm feeling hopeless today. Wow, what is that? What do I need to do to address that, right? And then maybe you stop and you think, okay, well, I'm going to meditate on precious human rebirth for a while to recognize there's not just a little hope, there's amazing hope, right? Because of what I am. I'm this kind of being. I can meditate on Buddha nature, right? Which is very hopeful, right? Recognition that, I have the potential for full enlightenment of a Buddha. And you meditate on that until your mind comes to a sense of enthusiasm, right? And then you could go meditate on bodhicitta. Does that make sense? Kind of. So what he's getting at here is like, it's not, you need to like introspect and be honest with yourself. What's my mind doing? And then you need to understand the meditation, your options of meditation. You have this like huge menu now, right? That's what Lamrim is, isn't it? Like Lama Tsongkhapa has given us this like amazing gourmet menu, and you have to know then, like, what do I need today, right? What do I need this morning or this afternoon that's going to help my mind? And it's like you're learning to take care of your own mind, right? Anyway, so that's what that section is getting at. So he says, from these indications, you should also understand situations that have not been explained. In brief, you should not become one-sided. Your mind should be serviceable in all virtuous directions, right? So what he's getting at there is he gave some examples, right? And I started giving others, right? But what he's saying is whatever state you find yourself in, you should look at that state, and then you should apply whatever the appropriate meditation is to either, if you're off track, get yourself back on track. If you're on track but not very on track, then apply whatever will get you more strongly on track, right? And that's like a pith instruction from Lama Tsongkhapa that comes from the lineage. Any questions about that before I move on? The last section is how to train in Vajrayana. But any questions about that before I go on? Okay. So the last thing, which is a conclusion, chapter 6 conclusion, it says, explanation of how to train in the uncommon vehicle, the Vajrayana. And so I want to read it. Actually, I want to read the first paragraph of this because I think it's again like almost like a pith instruction from Tsongkhapa to us, an oral instruction kind of. He says, having thus trained in the paths that the two, sutra and mantra, have in common, right? So these are what he taught up to here were the common paths. If you're going to practice Sutrayana, you have to practice those if you want to practice the Mahayana Dharma. But if you want to practice Tantra, you also have to practice those equally. They're equally important. But he says, once you've trained yourself in those somewhat, he says, you should doubtlessly engage in Vajrayana or Mantrayana practice, because that path is extremely rare compared with other Dharma teachings and makes you complete the two collections quickly. So Tsongkhapa, this is his advice, right? Is he saying, once you have some familiarity with Lamrim, you should enter into the Vajrayana practice. And he's saying, why? He's saying, he's kind of saying, why should you do that? Why am I suggesting that, right? Tsongkhapa never just says something without explanation. And so he's saying, here he makes 2 points. One is it's very rare. And according to the Indo-Tibetan Buddhism, most Buddhas don't teach Tantra. Even most of the Buddhas who will come to this planet, they said that there are going to be 1,000 Buddhas, and this Buddha was, I think, was it third or the fourth? I think he was the fourth. But I think they say only 2 or 3 of the 1,000 Buddhas will even teach Tantra, and that Tantra is not taught in general because it's a secret teaching. It's a advanced teaching. It's a esoteric teaching. So one point is it's rare and hard to find. Actually, that's true even on this planet. If you look at, first of all, most people aren't Buddhist at all. But if you look at the Buddhist teachings even, Tantra is not taught much, actually, right? Like, in other words, if you look in the South Asian traditions, where many Buddhists are, right? Like in, Cambodia and Laos and all those countries, there's no Vajrayana teachings at all. And then if you look in East Asia, there's not much, actually. Japan has a little bit of teaching of one yoga tantra. Vietnam, they say, I met some Vietnamese people who say historically there used to at some point be some Vajrayana teachings in Vietnam, but they were lost. Now some Vietnamese people are studying Tibetan Buddhism, but Vietnam lost its lineage of Vajrayana teachings. China has very little except for what came from Tibet. Anyway, so the Vajrayana teachings are rare, is one point. And then the second point he makes, Tsongkhapa makes here, is it makes you complete 2 collections quickly. And so the idea there is this, is in general, if you want to become a Buddha, right? If you want to become a Bodhisattva and then become a Buddha, right? The Mahayana teachings in general say that it takes eons, right? They say Shakyamuni Buddha took 3 countless great eons, right? I think an eon is a one with something, there are different scholars some say it's 57 zeros, or some say it's 58 zeros, years. That's how long an eon would be. So there's not a number, there's not a word for that, right? Trillion, we don't have a word for a one with 58 zeros after it. But they say that's how long it takes. If you're going to practice the Sutrayana practice to become a Buddha, it takes a length of time of 3 countless great eons. Whereas if you practice, they say if you practice the 3 lower class, there are 4 classes of Tantra taught in general. And if you practice the 3 lower classes of Tantra, they say you can achieve enlightenment in 1 lifetime. But then, but it's by extending your life. There's like certain yogas they can do or something to extend their life, but so it's a long life. But then they say, if you practice highest yoga Tantra, you can achieve enlightenment or Buddhahood in 1 brief life of this degenerate age. You know, it's like in 60, 70 years, something like that, you can become a Buddha. So it's inconceivable. You know, like what he's saying is the idea that somebody can become a Buddha that quickly is unbelievably rare and precious. And those teachings exist on this planet, and Tsongkhapa taught them in detail. And so if you're interested really in becoming enlightened, then it would be like an amazing loss of opportunity not to practice the Vajrayana, is what he's saying. Then he says, when you engage in, it is essential to rely on a spiritual teacher when you engage in mantra. And by the way, mantra here is not the word, it means, it's referring to the mantrayana, right? So they're just synonyms. I just want to say that. Like in Tibetan Buddhism, you can say there's like the, so we say like, sometimes you say Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. But anyway, Vajrayana, Vajra is like, there are different translations of the word Vajra. Sometimes they translate it as diamond, or sometimes thunderbolt, or anyway. But mantrayana, so mantra vehicle and Vajra vehicle are synonyms. So he uses them interchangeably here. So he says, when you engage in it, meaning the Vajrayana, you should first make your teacher happy in excess of what was explained above, according to the statements in Atisha's Lamp for the Path, the original root text of the Lamrim. It should be someone who at least has all the characteristics explained there. So what he's getting at there is he's getting at a couple of really key points here. One is, in general, he said, if you want to practice Mahayana Buddhism, you need a Lama, right? But then for the practice of the Vajrayana, it's absolutely essential. It's impossible to practice Vajrayana without a Lama, is one point. And so what he's saying is, a Lama who you're going to study the Vajrayana with should have all the qualities of a Vajrayana teacher, and those are listed in the texts. Actually, you can study that. They're listed in. Actually, I had requested Kibe Khyentse Rinpoche to teach, and it was what got canceled. Part of that was going to be a teaching on the 50 verses of Guru devotion, which is a teaching of how to relate to a Vajrayana teacher and what the qualities of a Vajrayana teacher are. So hopefully Khyentse Rinpoche will come and teach that still. But I want to actually say a few points here, though. So one is, because in the next paragraph, Tsongkhapa says, part of the reason you absolutely need a Lama is you have to receive initiation to practice Tantra. And you have to receive an initiation from a fully qualified teacher. And, this is not unique to the West. This used to happen in Tibet also, but it happens in the West now. So I just want to say a couple things. One is, it's our job to check, does the Lama have the qualities of a Vajrayana teacher? He says that here, right? He just said it. So that means, you shouldn't, actually I want to say that Tsongkhapa is saying, essentially, you'll see if you if you look on Google or Facebook or whatever, when the coronavirus is not happening, in any given year, there are a whole bunch of people come through any given big city and give initiations, right? Like Tibetans usually. Somebody, usually they'll have a title Rinpoche, and they'll come to town and they'll give initiation. And I want to make a couple points. One is, the instruction, I've always found this confusing a little bit, because that's been the tradition for a long time, I think. But the truth is that, if you don't know that person, and you haven't checked that they're qualified as a teacher, you shouldn't go to the initiation. I'm not endorsing or putting down any individual person. What I'm saying is, it's our job to check. Does that make sense? Because if you go to an initiation from a Lama, you're establishing a relationship where that Lama is now your Lama. That's the nature of that process. If a particular Lama comes to town and is giving an initiation, and if you participate actively in that initiation, you're establishing that they're your Lama, your Guru, you're their disciple. And what Tsongkhapa is saying here is, so it's not my advice, it's Tsongkhapa's. He's saying it should be someone who at least has all the characteristics explained, right? So if all you did was read a flyer, like on Facebook or something, that says so-and-so is a great Lama and they whatever, says some advertisement. And if you based on like a paragraph advertisement, you decide to take somebody as your Vajrayana guru, that's not what the Vajrayana teaches to do. Does that make sense? What the Vajrayana says is you're supposed to check and get to know that person and learn about them and research about them, because you're establishing an important karmic relationship to that person. So the idea that Tsongkhapa is saying is you should check up on the Lama. You should be confident that it's a valid person, that Lama has, is ethical, is compassionate, is learned, knows about, Tantra, but also has realizations of the practice and the path and things like that, is deeply committed to a life of love and compassion and service, and so on. Like, anyway, there are all these lists of things they should know, but he's saying that's our responsibility, right? And then you should, once you determine that person has those qualities, you should relate to them like your Lama, with devotion and, make them happy, meaning practice, that you should be, then you should practice the path. And so, we should, what's there to say, right? So that's our responsibility, is to find, if you want to practice Vajrayana, you have to find a teacher qualified to give the initiation of initiations into Vajrayana. And then I want to make another point, just a practical point, which is, so one is you shouldn't just go to anybody randomly. It's serious relational. Actually, there's a word they use, samaya. I think it's a beautiful word in Sanskrit. They sometimes translate it as commitment. But actually, I like Garchen Rinpoche. I like this. He says, the real samaya is love. And what he was getting at, I think, is it's a relationship. Like, in other words, when you enter into that kind of relationship to a teacher, you're creating a relationship of love and devotion and guidance with that teacher. And, it's like, and we can harm our samaya, but I sometimes think, it's like you can harm your samaya, but it's like any relationship, you can harm it, right? Like, in other words, if you are, I don't know, if you're in love with somebody, I'm talking now outside of Dharma context. If you're in love with somebody, right, you have a connection to them. And you can do things that foster that connection and make it better, or you can do things that harm it, right? We all know that from life. So samaya with a teacher is like that, right? Like, in other words, so you have to first be sure you're entering into a relationship with the right teacher, somebody who has the qualifications of a proper teacher. And then you relate to them carefully. Does that make sense? Like, you develop a positive relationship to that person. And so I want to make one more point then, also, that sometimes it's happened in the past, I think, but it still happens. That, like, so one is, there are people who teach Vajrayana who are not ethical, and there are stories in the news about people who were unethical teachers. That's not just Vajrayana, it's also Zen and other traditions. But it's our responsibility to be careful, is one point. And to be cautious about who we enter into that relationship, this kind of relationship with. Then another point, though, is it's also not enough. Like, sometimes lamas will come to town and they'll give some big initiation and then leave town, and there's no commentary. There's no explanation of the vows. Because when you take a tantric initiation, there are vows and commitments connected to that. And so I just want to say, also be careful about that too, that it's not so good, actually, if you take initiation but then don't study that and practice it, right? Because when you take, if you take like a highest yoga tantra initiation, for example, there are certain commitments connected to that, so you should study and learn what they are and practice. Does that make sense? Otherwise, it's not so good. Just take it and then, like, as if it's like as if you went to a Broadway show or something like that. Like, it's not that. It's a spiritual practice. So ideally, it should be a context where you get to study them and practice the thing. So then he says, so Tsongkhapa says, first you should have your mental continuum ripened by means of an empowerment, explained in the authentic tantric texts. Then you should hear and understand the commitments and vows taken on that occasion and guard them, right? So Tsongkhapa is saying what I just said, right? It's not enough just to take the initiation. You should then hear and understand the commitments and vows you've taken, right? That are part of Vajrayana practice. If a root downfall occurs, even if a vow can be taken again, the development of positive qualities on the path will be delayed, greatly delayed in your continuum. So endeavor not to be tainted by that. Try not to be tainted by a serious downfall and apply the means of restoring your vows and commitments if you take if one gets tainted. And then there's a quote there. It says, essentially, it's saying you won't achieve the realizations and the qualities if you don't guard your commitments. And it says in the highest Yoga Tantra, it says those who do not guard their commitments or have an inferior empowerment do not understand suchness or emptiness will not accomplish anything despite their practice. So what it's saying here is just, it's very simple and straightforward, I think, actually. If you're interested in Vajrayana, right, there's steps to go through. First, you practice the general Lamrim, right, get familiar with it. Then you seek out or research and find a teacher who's qualified to teach Vajrayana, and especially to give the initiations and so on. Once you receive the initiation, you should study what are your commitments. What are the vows and commitments of that system? And you should try to keep those, right? One really nice thing, so I want to make a point. I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are 4 classes of Tantra, right? So the first class of Tantra, actually, I'll just say at one point, all 4 classes have initiations that are given, but in the West, my experience has been most of the initiations given are Action Tantra, which is the lowest or the most introductory of the 4, or highest Yoga Tantra, which is the most advanced of the 4. It's pretty rare that anybody gives initiations in the other 2, although it does happen, but it's rare. And so with Action Tantra, usually the vows are the Bodhisattva vows. That's usually the vow given. That is the vow given during an Action Tantra initiation. It's the Bodhisattva vow. With highest Yoga Tantra, there are other vows given that are tantric vows. One nice thing, in case you, I mean, again, which I won't go into detail about, but it makes it easier to keep the vows, actually, is in the Gelugpa tradition in particular, the first Panchen Lama, Losing Choki Gyaltsen, who wrote the Guru Puja and the Easy Path, he wrote many texts. He wrote something called the 6-session Guru Yoga. And it's a practice you do, it can be brief, but it is brief, but it's a practice you do 6 times a day, and it helps you keep your vows. So most Gelugpa Lamas, if you take a highest Yoga Tantra initiation from them, they'll give a commitment, which is to practice this 6-session Guru Yoga. The purpose of that is to keep your vows. And so one thing would be to get a commentary on the 6-session Guru Yoga if you do that. So you can understand what are the vows and how are you keeping them. So anyway, what he's getting at here is, again, it's not enough just to take an initiation as if you went to a show. You find a qualified teacher, you take the initiation, you keep the vows. Then he says, then once you are keeping the vows, you should then gradually train in the practices, right? And then that's where he says that either in the 3 lower classes of Tantra, this is like just the overview. I mean, you can study this more later, but in the 3 lower classes of Tantra, there are 2 parts of the practice: a yoga with signs and a yoga without signs. Highest Yoga Tantra has a different label. It's different. It's generation stage and completion stage. Anyway, so either if you're practicing any of the 3 lower tantras, you would practice the yoga with signs, the yoga without signs. If you're practicing highest Yoga Tantra, you'd practice generation stage and then the completion stage. And then Tsongkhapa says something else. He says, here only the side of entering mantra is presented just nominally, right? So he's saying, I'm just giving a very brief introduction to this. He says, so you must get to know these in detail from the stages of the path of mantra. And so that's another text, actually, Tsongkhapa wrote. After he wrote the great treatise on the Lamrim, he wrote a great treatise on the stages and paths of mantra. And that's actually, just so you know, I mean, that text is a very long text, but then various Gelugpa authors composed shorter summaries of that, briefer versions of it. And one of the studying one of those briefer versions is actually part of the basic program. This program we're doing. So what I was, if someday, if there, I mean, it would be like late. I mean, we have a whole bunch of text to do first, but if there are enough people someday who, study and practice the other texts and then really want to practice Vajrayana, especially highest Yoga Tantra or something like that, then in the future, actually, we could do that. We could, like in other words, we could have a Lama come and give a highest Yoga Tantra initiation. And then, we could actually study the, they would give some teachings, like some Khenchen is already teaching, right? little bit on the, I mean, he's taught many of these things already, but, and the teaching on the 51st Sugur devotion is part of this. But in the future, someday, if there were enough students who are interested, a Lama could give, you know, if people wanted to, then they could take initiation from a Lama, and then we could actually study one of those briefer texts on the stages of the path of mantra. Because then it really, you understand. The point I'm getting at, though, is really this, is that one should, if you're really interested in Tantra, you know, you take initiation from that qualified teacher, then you have to, there are various things you do if you're really interested. One is you study the vows. You study, get a commentary on the succession guru yoga, or just on the vows themselves. And that's been done before at the center. It could be done again at the center. And then you study like stages and paths of mantra, and there are those short texts. I mean, they're not that short, but they're much shorter than Tsongkhapa's text. They're shorter than this Lam Rim text also. They're like maybe, I don't know, 50, 60 pages, something like that. Those give a very good kind of grounded understanding of Tantra. And then if it's highest yoga Tantra, the other thing to do is to get a commentary on the generation stage of whatever practice you're doing. And then you do the sadhana, the practice, regularly. So that's actually, you know, that's what one does in a sense. Does that make sense, kind of? So, oh, the easy path. That is some, this game, that has some introduction to Tantra also, doesn't it? A little more introduction than this Lam Rim actually does. But anyway, so that's the because a lot of people have actually that's an important point. So one is, I just want to summarize this before, and then I'll go on to the conclusion. So Tsongkhapa's advice is, once you're familiar with Lam Rim, don't miss out on the chance to study Tantra. It's rare and it's precious and helps you achieve enlightenment more quickly. That's one point. Second point he says is, if you're interested in that, if you decide to do that, take your time to find a qualified teacher. Don't just study with anybody. You know, receive the initiation. If it's Action Tantra, for example, then you receive that initiation of Action Tantra. If it's highest yoga Tantra, you receive that initiation, whichever, you know, whatever you're interested in. You know, you find a qualified teacher, you receive initiation from them. But then he's saying, then whatever initiation you receive, make sure you learn from somebody the vows and commitments connected to that particular practice. They're actually pretty straightforward, not hard to study. And then receive a commentary on how to do the tantric practice itself, right? If it's the generation stage, then it would be like, you know, for example, you would receive a commentary on the yoga with signs and yoga without signs of like Green Tara or Avalokiteshvara or Manjushri, or there are many different practices. There, you know, Medicine Buddha, you know, there are different like initiations. Or if it's highest yoga tantra, now Guhya Samaja, the name of the center, is one of the highest yoga tantras. In the Glick tradition, that's one of the commonly done ones. Of highest yoga, there's Guhya Samaja, Yamantaka, Chakra Samvara, Vajrayogini, Hivadra, and Kala Chakra. Those are the commonly done ones in the Gelugpa tradition, and in the Kagyu, actually, too. And the Sakya. Actually, those are all in common with those. They're all common practices. But so you receive a commentary on the stages and paths of Tantra, if you can, and also on the generation stage, if it's the highest yoga Tantra. And then you do the practice. You know, that's what you need. And you make progress. So that's the general instruction of how you proceed if you're interested in studying Tantra. And, you know, some Dharma, I mean, you know, anyway, and Guhya Samaja Center has a good history with that of, you know, because we've had the good fortune of being connected to Gyume Khensa Rinpoche, who's a Tantric abbot, you know, he can give those initiations, for example. Lama Zopa Rinpoche gives them, so Lama gives them, and various other lamas do. And so then he says, Tsongkhapa says, if you train in such a way, you will train in the complete body of the path that summarizes all the essential points of Sutra and Tantra, and you will make the leisure you have achieved meaningful through your training. You will be able to make the jewel of the victor, Buddha's teachings, develop in your own mind and the minds of others. So what he's saying there, in a sense, is if you practice Lam Rim, and then if you also, in addition to that, receive like an initiation and practice the Tantra practice too, he says, essentially what he's saying is there's no better use of a precious human rebirth than that. There's nothing else you can do. That's the best possible use of your precious human life. And that's Lama Tsongkhapa's advice, you know, to all of us. And then he concludes by saying, one is he points out that he says, now he's saying, so I've composed this text, and then um, he says, the Buddha taught sutra and tantra approaches, two aspects of the path. Those excellent texts on the path of all the sutras and the tantra and the treatises easily come to be seen as direct instructions through the fearless faith that one is given. So first he's saying, why did I compose this text in a way, right? And he's making one point. He's saying, if you understand the Lamrim well, he said, like, actually, and I think this is true, actually, it's a gift to us. Because now, if you understand the Lamrim well, you can pick up any Buddhist teaching. There are thousands of different teachings, right, out there, many thousands of teachings. And he says, and you'll understand how to practice and where it fits. So it will arise, it will easily be understood as a practical instruction. So he's saying, now that you've studied Lamrim, and he says that's part of why he composed this text, is like then, now you'll be able to pick up different Buddhist texts and different teachings, different sutras, different treatises. And whatever you study, if you think about it, you'll go, oh, okay, this is where that would fit into Lamrim. Here's how I can apply it to my practice. That's one point. Then he says, another point. He says, common great vehicle paths explained in the Tantras are all made clear, which supremely trains the mind. So what he's saying is all the points that are shared by Sutra and Tantra that you need to practice Tantra were explained in this text. Does that make sense? Like if you practice Lamrim, that's the ideal preparation for Tantra. I remember like a few years ago, Gyume Khenchen was giving Yamantaka initiation up in Connecticut that time. And he said something interesting. They said, what's the prerequisite? And he said, the prerequisite is familiarity with Lamrim. You see, he was saying, if you're familiar with Lamrim and you want to take this, then you can come. But if you're not familiar with Lamrim, then you shouldn't, that's the prerequisite. You shouldn't take tantric teachings. So it's like those are the prerequisites and those are the basic trainings that you have to practice Tantra if you're interested in that. And then he says, then he makes a point here. The last point he makes in that series, or not another point he makes rather in that series is that this particular text, he basically says he gave a lot of detail on how to develop calm abiding, which we covered that section, of course. And he's saying that's a unique feature of this text. That he's making a point that sometimes people misunderstand the process of gaining calm abiding, and so he's sort of saying he explained that very precisely and in a lot of detail in this text. So if you need to understand more about, if you need to understand for your own practice how to progress in calm abiding, he's suggesting rely on these teachings. And then he says, this summary of the stages of the path, I rearranged for those who want liberation. So who is this composed for? For those who want liberation. And then he says, the path of the view that's profound and extensive behavior passed from the regent Maitreya, the noble Manjushri, to the protector Nagarjuna, and Asanga, and Shantideva, three rivers that were merged, the supreme instructions of Atisha. So there what he's pointing out is that, these instructions he just shared in this text, what are they? Right? He's saying, there are lineages that came down from India into Tibet. And one is the lineage of what he calls the profound, right? That's emptiness. Right? He's saying that came from the Buddha to Manjushri to Nagarjuna, and then down through the lineage of Nagarjuna. Tsongkhapa, Atisha received that, and Tsongkhapa received that, and that's in this text. Then he's saying another lineage was the lineage of the extensive behavior, the extensive deeds of bodhisattvas. That came from Maitreya to Asanga, and then down to Atisha, and down to Tsongkhapa. That's in this text. Then he says also there's a third lineage of Shantideva, right, who wrote the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, which we've agreed to study after the Heart Sutra. Right? He's saying those instructions are also integrated in this text. And so what he's pointing out is this text, what's the word, integrates or combines the teachings of those great beings. And then he says, through the merit gained here by my effort may the victor's teachings, the root of all welfare, prosper uncorrupted for a long time. And then I'll just read the last paragraph that he wrote. He says, this was a summary of all the scriptures of the Buddha, the tradition of the great trailblazers, Nagarjuna and Asanga, right, from those two lineages. The Dharma system of supreme beings who progress towards the level of omniscience, Buddhahood. It was a presentation of the stages of the path towards enlightenment that teaches in full all the stages to be practiced by the three types of beings, the meaning of the instructions that I have heard and that were transmitted both from Gonpawa and Usurpa, and from Chengawa, from Potawa to Sharawa, and from Potawa to Dopa. Right, those are the Kadampa lineage that came after Atisha in Tibet. This additional summary of the extensive presentation of the stages of the path was composed by the learned and renounced monk Tsongkhapa Losang Dragpa Pel on Mount Gendon. Right. So he's saying, where did he compose it? At Gendon, where Gendon Monastery is. And then the rest here actually is not Tsongkhapa, it's Trijang Rinpoche. You know, this text had the outline points that were added by Trijang Rinpoche, who is the junior tutor to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so the rest, actually I won't read the rest, it's just Trijang Rinpoche is kind of describing how he decided to add these outline points or header points to help people understand Tsongkhapa's text and understand how to structure it, how it's structured rather, the internal structure of the text. So it was like a kindness of Trijang Rinpoche that he sort of composed added these outlines so that we could more easily comprehend Tsongkhapa, what Tsongkhapa was saying. And so then, to conclude, I want to say a couple of just concluding points. One is, Tsongkhapa says right there that, the Lamrim that he composed summarizes, as he puts it, all the scriptures of the Buddha. And so I actually feel like, now we're concluding 5 years of studying this, which is quite something. And some of you were here all 5 years, some were part of that time, but that's still, it's been a big project actually to study this text together. And I think actually, we should right now in this moment try to, I'm feeling, and I want to suggest we all cultivate it, like some sense of joy, rejoicing, that we, I think sometimes like there are some topics, I don't know, that may or may not be useful, but Lamrim is really like the most essential instructions of the stages of the path. All the Tibetan traditions study these topics. This is Tsongkhapa's like essential instruction, deep, profound instruction on this. And so in a sense, by studying this together, you could say we've studied all the Buddhist scriptures together now. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because that's what Tsongkhapa says there, right? It's a summary of all the scriptures of the Buddha. So in a certain way, we could say now we've together like studied the essence of all the scriptures of the Buddha. And, I think and I really do feel like, from my side, I've learned a lot, by trying my best to share it. I apologize for any small mistakes. I tried my best to check everything with commentaries, and I double checked the points I wasn't sure about when I could with Khenpo Rinpoche. So I've done the best I could to explain everything accurately. And I think my impression has been that everybody's tried hard to study, also in practice. And so I think we've done a good job together. So I feel a sense of joy in that with everybody. It's a little strange that, after doing it in person for 5 years, our last class is via Zoom. But anyway, it's good. And so in a second, we'll do the dedication. I just want to say, so the plan though is in 2 weeks, we'll do like a 3-hour meditation practice on bodhicitta. This is to conclude this, like we've now concluded the study, but with the other sections, we had always done some practice together. So the idea is that in 2 weeks, at the same time, but it'll go an hour longer for those who want to attend, we'll actually just do like meditations on bodhicitta. And then I think it's like then the final thing would be May 8th, I think it is, or 9th. It's the 9th. I think it's the 9th. Anyway, it's on the schedule, but we'll do like meditations on emptiness, and that will be the final. In this series, that concludes the series of the Lamrim. So we'll do a little bit of practice. And then after, and I guess pretty soon I'll just go ahead and schedule the beginning of the classes on the Heart Sutra. So we'll just start adding those to the calendar, and then people can, I guess we'll just assume that, for as long as they have to be online, they'll be online like this format, and then when we can, we'll switch them to in person. So we'll just leave that flexible, I guess, as actual information unfolds about what's safe and what's not. But I'm guessing the first few classes on that might be via Zoom, but I'm not really sure. I'm sure some of them will be in person because that class will last a while. But anyway, it's 12:31. So the last thing we should do, though, is since we created a lot of merit, by studying Lamrim together, we definitely created a lot of good karma. So we should dedicate. And so we'll do a few dedications. So
Thank you, Lauren.
What's that?
Thank you.
Oh, sure. So we'll do the 2 we usually do, and then we'll add a couple of extras. So the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. And through these virtuous merits, you quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all beings, without exception, to that enlightened state. May everyone who sees us, hears our names, has any direct or indirect contact with us, may it be meaningful for them. May they enter the path to liberation and enlightenment, and may they achieve enlightenment as quickly as possible. Through these virtues, may the Dharma last long in this world, and may it spread in our minds and in the minds of other beings. And the final dedication, through these virtuous merits, which are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side. May the I, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, achieve Buddha's enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side. And lead all sentient beings who are merely labeled, totally empty from their own side, to the state of full enlightenment, which is merely labeled, totally empty from its own side, as quickly as possible. Well, thanks everybody for all your efforts. Yes, and like I said, so we got those classes scheduled and all that. The next 2, and then I'll schedule the Heart Sutra. But thanks for all the effort at studying Lamrim for years.
Thank you, Lauren. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, good
Thank
to
you,
see
Lauren.
Thank you.
Stay well,
See you
everybody.
guys.
Yeah, be well.
Dundrup, thanks for arranging this.
Yeah, thanks, Dundrup, for your work on this.
It was mostly me. That's true.
There would be no Zoom without you.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Lauren, call me later.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay.